folks, it's Emily hanging out in a far-flung part of the natural area today, and it's kind of where the northern fen meets the cedar swamp. Really diverse area with lots of blooming orchids this time of year, so that's what we're going to focus on today. So you might be wondering, what is an orchid? Well, it's just a plant in the family Orchidaceae, and that is actually one of, or possibly the largest plant family in the world. There's still some disagreement among scientists whether it's Orchidaceae, which is orchids, or Asteraceae, which are the asters. But there are estimates that there are anywhere from like mid-20,000s to mid-30,000s, about 30,000 species of orchids in the world. So to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times the total number of all bird species in the world, and about 4 or 5 times the total number of all mammal species in the world. So we're talking about a lot of plants, and they have some common characteristics. They're very variable and often very showy, but there are some common characteristics among all of these different orchids. So one of those things is their flowers they exhibit bilateral symmetry, so you could draw a line from the top to the bottom and it's symmetrical on both sides. Usually 3 petals and 3 sepals. They're monocots, so like a lily, but oftentimes the sepals and the petals look, you can't really tell the sepals from the petals. The sepals look very petal-like. And then one other major thing about the flower is orchids have one petal, usually the bottom petal, but sometimes the top petal, which we'll talk about later. One petal, called the labellum or the lip, is highly modified, and it's usually super fancy looking, a lot of times bright colored or like a pouch shape, like in the case of lady slippers, and those serve the purpose of attracting pollinators. Now, the last major important characteristic of orchid flowers is that they have what's called a column. So instead of like a normal flower where the male sex organs in the stamen and the female sex organs in the pistil are kind of separate, like oftentimes the stamen, the things that poke up and have the anthers, the little with pollen on top, are surrounding the female sex organ, the pistil. But in orchids, that is all combined into one organ called the column. And we'll see examples of it later. So one last thing about orchids that's important to note is that their seeds are tiny, like smaller than specks of dust or flour, because they don't have any nutrients that go along with the seeds. It's basically just the embryo, and they don't have that nutrient package that most seeds have. And so when it lands, how does it grow? How does it get nutrients? It must be invaded by a certain type of fungus that it's mycorrhizal with, a certain type of mycorrhizal fungus, and it gets nutrients from the fungus. So their seeds are super tiny, they have lots of them, and they're just like cast everywhere with the wind, and maybe like a very, very, very small percentage of them actually ever germinate and ever make it to an actual new plant. Okay, so with that background on orchids, let's go explore this area and see which ones we can find. All right, friends, here we have the Showy lady slipper. It's pretty aptly named, if you ask me. It is our tallest native orchid that we have in the northern US. And its specific epithet, its species name, Regina, literally means queen, and that's easy to see why. So here is the labellum. This pouch imbued with this beautiful magenta color is all one highly modified petal, and that's the labellum. And then there are 2 sepals fused together behind the labellum that you can't see right now, and then the 2 structures on either side of the flower are the lateral petals, and then this is a sepal at the top. So sepals in lady slippers, at least, and many other orchids, look a lot like petals. So this species of orchid is pollinated by medium-sized bees. And I should talk about this interesting pollination method of orchids. So this yellow sort of blush right here, that's mimicking pollen. So what this orchid is doing is actually tricking insects, because this orchid has no nectar, which is why insects fly into flowers in the first place, right? To get that nectar reward, and then they get pollen on their body and then fly off and pollinate the next flower. But this orchid and many others that we'll see today doesn't actually produce nectar. So this is all a ruse. It's tricking the insects. And so the insects fly in the column back here. And then to prevent self-pollination, many orchids have interesting sort of like physical barriers to insects getting the pollen on them on their way down into the column. They can only get the pollen, or pollinia in orchids. Pollen is packaged into these like sticky pollen packets. They can only get the pollinia on them as they back out of the orchid, so that prevents self-pollination. So let's see. Oh, and one more thing is that if you've noticed, I've been avoiding touching these leaves of the showy lady slipper. Nice, beautiful, really lush, parallel veined leaves, because they have tiny hairs on them that can cause a rash similar to poison ivy, so you want to avoid touching those. And if you see a showy lady slipper in the wild, take a moment to admire it, because oftentimes it takes a showy lady slipper plant up to 16 years to produce its first flower, and these plants can be extremely long-lived. They can live to be way over 50 years old, so pretty impressive plant. All right, and here is a specimen of grass pink, another type of orchid. And you can see that it's a really long, skinny stem. And it'll have one grass-like leaf. And this species of orchid often, or almost always, has multiple flowers on the same stem, and they always open from bottom to top. And this orchid is interesting because it's what's called non-resuppinant. So normally orchids, when they're in the flower bud, the labellum, the lip, is on the top, and then just before they open, they twist 180 degrees and open, so the labellum's on the bottom. So grass pink does not do that. This right here, this is the labellum, and it's on the top. And there's a very specific reason for that. This species has a really interesting pollination method. So let's see. Get it focused. All right, so you can see that the labellum has some bristles, and there is some spots of yellow, and that's again to mimic pollen. So pollinators, usually bumblebees in this species, come in to try and get their nectar reward. Again, like the showy lady slipper, there is no nectar reward, but what happens when the bumblebee lands on the labellum, the bumblebee is heavy enough to make the labellum hinge downward, and what happens is it makes the insect land on its back on the top of the column right here. And so what happens is that any pollen that was on the insect is stuck to the stigma, the top of the column, the female sex organ in the column, and the insect picks up any new sticky packets of pollen. So that's a really neat pollination method coming to you from grass pink. All right, so here we have the tall white bog orchid. It's pretty aptly named. It is tall, it's white, and it grows in bogs, fens, and marshes. It's also called bog candles, and it's structured pretty differently than the other orchids we've looked at today, in that instead of having just one or a few flowers on top of a stem, it has many, up to 65, but each of those flowers are structured in the same way that the other orchid flowers we've been looking at are. So the top sepal and the lateral petals form the hood above each little flower. The little spurs are the lateral sepals, and then the labellum, the modified petal at the bottom. And this orchid exudes a pretty alluring scent. It's kind of a combination of cinnamon and cloves, and that lures in pollinators like skippers, so like a type of butterfly, and owlet moths. And lucky for those pollinators, this orchid does have nectar. So the nectar is exuded from a little spur off the labellum. So those insects do get a nectar reward. And then the green, the light green part in here, that is where the column is. And this is one of my favorite orchids because it is so hardy. It can grow in far northern Canada, way above the Arctic Circle, like on Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island. It actually grows on tundra up there as long as the tundra is wet. So, very hardy orchid. Thanks for tuning in to this Grass River Microclass where we explored the orchids of Grass River Natural Area. And I should say some of the orchids because we have upwards of 10 orchids here in the natural area. They just bloom at different times throughout the year, spring and summer. So stay tuned next week because we have our intern Kyla Foley who will be presenting a microclass on how wetlands and wetland vegetation specifically increase water quality in the area. So I will see you then, and until then, have a great week. Bye everyone.